Today's guest is Frank White. He is an author and space philosopher. One of his most famous books is The Overview Effect: Space Exploration and Human Evolution. It has coined the term the overview effect, describing the effect on astronauts of looking down on Earth and it changing their perspectives on almost everything. From Beyond Media, I'm Felix Tuchinski, and this is Humanity and Beyond. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm working on the fourth edition of the Overview Effect, which will be out in 2021. And nothing I like better than interviewing astronauts and then editing the interviews for publication. It's always fun and interesting to see what they have to say.
Speaking of editing and publishing novels, I was particularly interested when I saw that you had co-authored two books with Isaac Asimov. Now, different situations for both, of course, but I mean, just how was it working? I don't know how much you directly coordinated with him, if you ever got to speak with him in person, but how was it just being that closely associated with the grandfather of science fiction?
It was a dream come true in a way. I think that when I first started getting interested in space exploration, I believe the first science fiction book I read was written by Isaac Asimov, and then I remained a fan of his work for a very long time. So when I got the chance to work with him, it was really quite amazing. And it was not on science fiction, as it turned out. It was two nonfiction books. But as you may know, he wrote, I think, something like 400 books, and many of them were nonfiction. He knew a lot about everything, you know. And it was in the days before the internet, and almost everything was done by snail mail, you might say. And I was invited to work with him because he had contracts with a company called Walker Publishing, and I had been in touch with them, and they had bought my book called The SETI Factor, about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So in both cases, the books that I worked on, I was meant really not to be a co-author in either case. I was meant to be helping out, writing and editing. But when I wrote the first draft for the book, Think About Space, Isaac said it was really, really quite good the way it was, and he didn't have a lot to add. So he suggested Walker just publish it under my name. And of course, they didn't want to do that. They wanted it to include Isaac Asimov because of his reputation. And he consented to be co-author, and he added quite a bit to it, honestly. But I was very impressed with his response to it. And then a similar thing happened with the other book, March of the Millennia, where he wrote the first draft, and I was meant just to edit it. But again, he said, you know, Frank did so much work on this, he should be co-author. So all of this was done by mail. And then when I did work on the SETI Factor, I went to New York and interviewed him. And my interview with him is in the SETI Factor. So it was all quite wonderful. And we had hoped to do some more work together, but he died rather early. And so those plans never came to fruition. But, you know, working with one of your idols, what could be better?
When he suggested that you be the sole author, was it similar to an overview effect level of emotion?
If you think of the overview effect as a peak experience, I suppose in that sense it was similar because it was being validated as a writer by one of the greatest writers of our time. I was quite pleased with it, but I also had an interesting experience with that book, which was there are times when, as a writer, you just write an entire first draft and it really is good. And there are times when you struggle, it's hard. The first draft of that book was really very straightforward. I don't want to say easy because I don't think writing is ever easy, but it flowed. I think that's the right word for it. I think that's what he picked up on, that it really just flowed and hit the target pretty well. It was a book for young people, and I think that that was a different experience for me to write a book for young people. So I had to think about high school students, I should say. I had to think about the tone, and I guess I just captured it. I don't know. I mean, it was a great validation, I'd say.
It's kind of interesting how, in terms of the overview, then how hard it is to describe because it's.
Yeah,
I get.
writing the overview effect was not easy.
Yeah, I can. That I can see might not have been as straightforward to write as you put it. Just a real world example. A good way to put it is art is shaped by the medium, and if we see the view of the Earth as an art form, then the portrait for it would be the Virgin Galactic spaceship, as you spoke of it. And they've only recently released their design for the crew cabin. Have you seen it?
I have, yes.
How do you think Virgin's approach to it as kind of this airliner with the blue lighting and all that? Do you think it'll accentuate it or?
Well, I'm not too surprised that it's very thoughtfully done, very carefully done. There's a lot of attention to the experience, and that's what the overview effect is. It's an experience. Also, unlike NASA astronauts or airline pilots, airline passengers, I should say, the point of the flight is the experience, right? When I take a plane from Boston to San Francisco, although I might have quite an important experience, it's not the reason that I take that flight. When NASA astronauts or Russian cosmonauts get into a spacecraft and go to the International Space Station, the reason is not the experience. Although increasingly, astronauts are beginning to realize that the experience is pretty important. The experience of seeing the Earth from orbit is changing them. So they're beginning to see that. But this is different because Virgin is essentially marketing the overview effect. And I interviewed Sir Richard Branson for the third edition of the overview effect, and he agreed that that's what he's marketing. I said to him, aren't you basically offering people the overview effect? And he said, yes, that's right. And I said something more about it. And then he said, but we don't want to take your brand. You know, in other words, we want to be careful not to tread on your toes. I said, oh, use the term. That's why it's out there. I want people to use the term. And they do use it. But my point is, it's very clear that the Virgin people have thought deeply about what they're going to offer. And one of the aspects that I was impressed about was they say, don't bring your camera. A lot of people have asked me my advice to people going on a commercial space flight, and I've consistently said, have the experience. Don't spend your whole time taking selfies, you know, have the experience. And we're so focused on selfies in our time that we are more focused on that than what's going on and where we are. So I noticed in their promotional video, they have 16 cameras that will be running the whole time. They have a big mirror at the back so you can see yourself. And they're basically saying, don't bring your camera. And that is critical because this will not be an orbital flight. It will be quick. And you could easily come back from it just saying, I missed it. I don't know what happened. I don't know if I experienced the overview effect, you know? That would be sad. And yet, I'm not putting myself into any special category. I think we all have become just intuitively, when we're in a different place, we pull out our iPhones because we can. So I think that's very important. Obviously, they have thought about everything because the seats are well designed. You know, the windows are there. I mean, it's not going to be hard to get a view of the Earth. and they have set it up so that weightlessness is going to be pretty safe. Weightlessness can be a problem when you come back and you fall to the bottom of the craft, you know. So I'm very impressed with what they're doing, but I'm not really surprised because I have friends who work there. I have interviewed Sir Richard, and I'm not too surprised. They're very focused on the experience.
But obviously, there's a growth in the numbers of people that can go up there, and not just astronauts. Do you believe that there's a tipping point, like at a certain point where the overview effect, like we speak of a future where a certain percentage of people have experienced the overview effect, and that affects global politics, or just maybe not to get into politics, but affects the world for like policies go towards Earth as a living organism, and that's in societal consciousness. Is there like a tipping point? Like I know it's difficult to give an exact number. Would it take just maybe getting the politicians up there, or is it something like getting enough of the voter bloc up there, or just what are your thoughts on the concept?
Well, let's just talk about the view of the Earth from orbit or the moon, including people actually going, and just look at the entire phenomenon. I think most historians would agree that the Apollo missions, although they only involved 24 people total, as I recall, the imagery that they sent back, especially the Earthrise picture, has already had an effect in terms of environmental awareness and policy around the environment. So we've already seen that. As far as a tipping point beyond that, I don't know if we can have a specific number, but in my book, I wrote about adoption of innovation theory. And this is a communications theory that shows you have different sectors of the population adopting an innovation at any one time. And of course, you have the early adopters, and then you have increasing numbers of people after them who take on an innovation. And if we think of the overview effect as an innovation in terms of thinking, you could say 20% of the world's population, or 20% of whatever population you choose, because there's some thought in innovation theory that once you've got 20% on board, it's very hard to stop an innovation. So you could use that. But the other thing I would share with you is that when I had the idea for the overview effect, what I was thinking about was what it would be like to see the Earth from outer space all the time. I was thinking about people who lived in an O'Neill space community between the Earth and the moon. They would always see the Earth in space. They would always see it as a whole system, interconnected, interwoven. We're all in this together. They would all have this understanding. And so I didn't see it as extraordinary. And I believe that as more and more people have the experience, even briefly, it will become ordinary. In other words, the shift will happen in a subtle way. It'll happen without us perhaps even noticing it. So that's one possibility. Right now, as you probably know, there are people all over the planet right now trying to, quote unquote, bring the overview effect down to Earth, trying to bring this astronaut awareness to more people on the planet. And I think that we are actually going to reach the tipping point sooner than we might imagine. And it won't depend totally on how many people actually experience it directly. It could include virtual experiences. And that's why I have taken a stand and said, I believe experiencing the overview effect should be a human right. I believe you should experience it. I believe I should experience it. I believe everyone should, because it really tells us who we are and where we are in the universe and where we're going. And I believe it would make a huge difference. So my stance is everybody should experience it. And the closer we get to everybody, the sooner I think we'll see a fundamental shift in consciousness on the planet. But we may miss it. We may look back and say that was the moment when it happened. Or maybe it's already happened.
We'll be right back. We just want to thank all our listeners, and especially our supporters. Without you, all this wouldn't be possible. The absolute best way you can help us is by sharing us on social media. If you really like what we are doing, you can support us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/humanityandbeyond. You've interviewed astronauts, obviously. Have you interviewed any recently enough that have experienced the VR equivalent, like that have been to space and witnessed the overview effect, and then come back down to Earth? A clear example I have is there's a YouTube video of an Apollo 17 astronaut who put a headset on and experienced the Apollo 11 mission essentially with the headset. So it included the launch, the coast phase, and the scene of Neil Armstrong landing. So obviously Apollo 7, I think he was in the comm room when Neil Armstrong landed foot. So that's the closest he got. But he said it was a darn good experience, I believe. But have you spoken to any space shuttle astronauts about it?
I've been thinking about this, and I can't recall anyone I talked to directly, but I know that when I was at NASA recently last year, I heard that some of the work they were doing on virtual reality had been seen by astronauts, and they felt it really brought back their experience. And also, I heard that Kenji Williams, who does an immersive show called Bella Gaia, I know he's worked with astronauts who have said that it has really brought back their experience. And he is not really using virtual reality. It's music, sound, large screens with imagery of the Earth and so on. So I don't know that I've talked to anybody directly, or I can't recall any of them saying that. But obviously, as we try to bring the overview effect down to Earth, it's a natural thing to show the astronauts what we've accomplished and ask them how close we are, because fidelity to their experience is what we're really shooting for.
The reason we're wanting to bring that experience back again is to have an effect down here. And one of the most common sentiments that I've heard is that we need to get politicians up there. Most realistically, this will probably be something that's taxpayer funded. Something like a theoretical scenario where, for example, either a portion of the NASA budget is dedicated to getting somebody like the president, for example, into space, or having a requirement in addition to, having been born in the U.S., being at least 35 years of age, and maybe having experienced the overview effect in reality. Would you support that?
Yeah, I would support it in the sense that astronauts do have that that thought. More than one astronaut has said we should have a summit conference in orbit, because the politicians they couldn't make the same decisions if they saw what we've seen. The obvious idea of how people go to Geneva, to a neutral country, to negotiate, or they go to Norway, or they go to Camp David, the presidential retreat. Clearly, it would be wonderful, and I hope it will happen, that we'll have a facility in orbit where people could go to do negotiations over hard, difficult problems on the Earth. I think it would make a huge difference. I think the biggest problem right now, if you imagine a president going, think about this, the security issues, the Secret Service. I mean, it's not just the president, it's an enormous retinue of people, and any head of state would be like that. However, politicians can do it. Jake Garn was a senator from Utah. He flew on the shuttle. Bill Nelson was at the time a congressman from Florida. I interviewed both of them for my book, and I think clearly it made a difference to them to have that experience. And I believe that we could begin to have government officials and politicians fly. It seems worthwhile to me. I don't know if everybody is aware of it, but Tom Cruise is theoretically going to go to the International Space Station and make a film. And NASA has opened up the ISS to various uses if the money can be paid that they're requesting, which is pretty stiff. It wouldn't have to be taxpayer funded if you think about it. If a foundation or a wealthy individual thought it was important to have a political figure or a government official of some kind go, if they paid the money, it could happen. And of course, if a government official wanted to go on Virgin Galactic and they wanted to spend their own money, I don't think there'd be anything prohibiting that. So think about it this way. Instead of thinking about taxpayer expense, think about a foundation or a project where you would raise the money to send people who make policy and send them to the ISS. If we focus too much on heads of state, we get into security problems that are hard to overcome. The other ideas, I have friends who have talked about how could we create the sense that they're in outer space. For example, I have a friend, Duncan McKenzie, who is interested in creating somehow how the United Nations people in the UN General Assembly could find themselves in orbit. So can we create the feeling that they're in orbit without having to send hundreds of people, which is not practical right now? So I'm all in favor of it by whatever means we can reasonably do it.
There a lot of climate scientists speak about how the next 10 to 20 years are incredibly important for reversing the worst effects of climate change, which of course are just one of the many issues that you've posited that the effect of the overview can change down here on Earth. You stated earlier that it'll come sooner than we think. Do you think it'll be quick enough to, for example, the countries follow maybe perhaps the Paris Agreement or rejoin the Paris Agreement?
Well, I think the time is very, very short, and it's not just climate change. If you've read a book called Limits to Growth, which was first published in 1972, they did quite a bit of computer modeling about the carrying capacity of the Earth relative to human impact on the Earth. And they predicted that eventually we would overshoot the Earth's ability to support us. And they've now issued two more editions. The most recent one was 2004, 30 years on, and they're convinced we're in the overshoot mode. We've already overshot the resources. There's another book by Chris Tucker called A Planet of 3 Billion. His work suggests that the Earth can support 3 billion people comfortably. As you may know, we're way over 3 billion. So I believe one of the reasons that we need to think seriously about moving out into other parts of the solar system is really to preserve the planet. It's not to leave the Earth or abandon it. And Gerard K. O'Neill was one of my mentors back in the 70s and 80s. And O'Neill had exactly this idea, and he was spurred to do his work by Limits to Growth. He felt we really can't tolerate the situation we're in. And he began to look at how do we create self-sustaining communities off the planet? How do we move some of the more destructive industries off the planet? And it's interesting to me that Jeff Bezos, who has his own company, Blue Origin, is a follower of O'Neill. And he says we have to leave the planet to save it. So the overview effect is a big part of that, because that gives you the consciousness of how precious the planet is. It gives you the awareness that we need to do something right away, urgently, to preserve what we have. We have to do all that work here on the surface, but I believe we also need to begin to think about how do we begin to use the rest of the solar system as our new environment. This is a long subject we probably can't go into, but yeah, I believe it's I believe it's a race against time, to be honest, before we're going to be in very difficult straits on the planet.
I took one class in philosophy, and I understand the definition of epistemology. I don't think I understand it at an intrinsic level. So I'm much more on the engineering side of things, the business model side of things. So I apologize that I can't contribute much to this conversation. But is there a lot of people would argue that the Earth is kind of out like ours to there's a lot of debate between Earth as an organism versus Earth as like a resource silo essentially. I'm trying to come to grasp with what different is it that the overview effect makes everyone an ecologist, or is it more, and going back to my previous question about politicians, more cynical people would say instead of bringing the politicians up, we need to bring those who are actually in control, the oligarchs. We don't up there, and some of them might refuse to go up there for almost a fear of having their worldview changed or having their opinions shifted because then they won't be able to provide the best value for their shareholders.
Well, to go back to your point, I took one class in philosophy at college too. And the only reason I started getting into philosophy of space exploration was that nobody else was doing it at the time. And right after the Challenger accident, there was a television program called This Week with David Brinkley. And Tom Wolfe, who wrote The Right Stuff, stated that we in this country, we've never had a philosophy of space exploration. So I decided, okay, nobody else is doing it. I'm going to give it a shot. And I think it's important. I don't mean philosophy as in epistemology, which was a big word that you mentioned, or ontology. I mean philosophy as a way of thinking, a way of approaching life, where you say, well, for uh, his philosophy for building a house is the following. This is the way you do it. So philosophy of space exploration is, how do we approach it? How do we think about it? What's important about the question you asked is the astronauts are increasingly coming back and saying, I saw the Earth as a living organism. That's what I experienced. Now, they're not philosophers. They're not sitting around thinking about it. They're in the International Space Station looking at the Earth, and that's what they feel about the Earth. Okay? So, if you look at it that way, you're going to treat it very, very differently from if you look at it as a big resource for you to exploit. So the important thing is, whichever way you look at it is going to affect how you're going to approach not only the Earth, but Mars and the Moon and other celestial bodies. And that is really what's most important, because even if we call ourselves astronauts of Spaceship Earth, right? Which is a metaphor that I like. And I tell people, you are an astronaut. The Earth is a spaceship. That's a metaphor I like, or an analogy I like. But even then, it's different from being part of a living organism. And it still sees us as separate from the Earth rather than a part of it. So I do believe that shift in awareness is very important. And as you know, indigenous people never needed to make that shift. Indigenous people always saw the Earth that way. They've always seen the Earth as the mother. And they've always had great reverence for the planet as an organism. And in a way, those of us raised in Western industrial society, our astronauts are really bringing back the wisdom of the indigenous people. So One of the ideas that comes out in the overview effect is the idea of a human space program, which is a central project for all of humanity to explore the universe in the next millennium or this millennium. And I have formed a nonprofit called the Human Space Program. We are going to have task forces that are going to tackle these kind of questions, like ethical questions, governance questions, economic questions. And we're going to do our best to create a comprehensive and sustainable and inclusive blueprint for exploring and developing the solar system. Because we have to. We can't stay here and keep doing what we're doing. And I think we're going to have a larger environment, but we're going to have to behave in a different way in that environment. And if you think about it, Felix, until really recently, people thought of the Earth as just this vast place that we couldn't hurt it, we couldn't really use it up. It was just there for us, and we could do a lot with it. We didn't think of it as having limits. And now I believe, largely because of the overview effect, we don't feel that way anymore. We have a different view of the Earth. So I believe we could begin to have a different view of the solar system as a whole. And it's very, very important what we're talking about, because I don't want to have our descendants 500 years from now look back and say, I wish Felix and Frank had done a better job when they supported human expansion into the solar system. I wish they thought about this, whatever this is. So,
of course, yeah, it's an interesting. I remember I listened to one of the podcasts you've been on, and you made the point that you did the math at one point, and something like only a third of the people, or not even less than that, something like 20% of the people alive today witnessed the moon landing, and there's a similar. I didn't do the math, of course, but I just thought it interesting that there's I was there's in my living memory, I don't remember a time when we didn't have a permanent human presence in space. And now there are adults who were born after November 2000. So there are people who have existed their entire lifespan where there were always people in space, where human beings traveling at 25,000 miles an hour, 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, in one of the most hostile environments you can imagine, is just a normal fact of life. Yeah, yeah, that dangerous everywhere else other than this, not than this rounding error of a percent of the universe that is habitable. Yeah, there's humans there.
I interviewed Nicole Stott, our recently retired astronaut, and she brought up that point when I interviewed her, that I was talking about what it's like to be a mother when you go to the ISS and your child is left behind with his father. And is it extraordinary or somewhat ordinary? And she said, well, he's never not known that there's an International Space Station with people on it. And so it is remarkable, and I think it is worth thinking about, because I was teaching a class on Apollo, one of my classes at Harvard Extension School, and I was going on and on about Apollo, and then I stopped and I thought, how many of you actually experienced it? How many of the people in my class had the experience of Apollo? And that led me to start doing the calculations. And whatever the number is, it's not very large. And it means that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the impact of the overview effect, the people who had that experience have died. Many, many of them have died. It means that when we talk about the overview effect, the only example they have is orbital. And it's very important to realize the difference between orbital views and lunar views of the Earth, because they're not the same. The overview effect is many times more powerful when seen from the moon. It's a great argument for another lunar landing, this time by a woman, as we know. And it's a great argument because then people like you can see it. It might not be quite as dramatic because, as you may know, the Earthrise photo, which is probably the most iconic photo from Apollo, was a surprise. It was a surprise to the astronauts. But the entire Apollo 8 mission was a bit of a surprise. It wasn't planned early on. There wasn't a lot of hype about it. So there will be a lot of hype about another lunar mission, but still giving this generation of people a chance to see the Earth from a distance like that is going to be great, wonderful.
What's the caption for the Apollo? I don't believe it's Apollo 8. I think it was Apollo 11. Michael Collins that took there's a photograph, and I remember a caption stating Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are in the capsule and everyone else is on Earth, and the only human being not included in the photo is Michael Collins.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's Apollo 11. And yeah, that was a remarkable moment. And in retrospect, you have to ask yourself, of the three astronauts, who had the most powerful experience, Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, or Buzz Aldrin? Not much has been written about the Apollo landings, but wherever there was a landing, there was one person left behind who was circling the moon. And, what were they thinking?
Because I don't remember the exact amount of time, but there was radio silence where the lunar modules on the surface of the moon, and the person that the most alone anyone's ever been was I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, the command module pilot for Apollo 17. His buddies were on the moon for 3 days. So when he was orbiting the moon, there was however many hours he experienced disconnected from the radio chatter of Earth or his buddies, meaning that he literally, it's just the other novel that expresses this well is The Martian, is being but with the Apollo missions, it's real. Somebody was that alone.
This is one of the thoughts to close on. Space exploration, when we ask what is the impact of space exploration, what I realized in writing the overview effect is its biggest impact is the change of consciousness of humanity. And each new movement off of Earth will change our consciousness overall. Having people permanently on the moon will have a change. If we build these freestanding O'Neill type communities, that'll have a change. Mars, going to Mars when you can't really see the Earth anymore except as a point of light. I started talking about other shifts in consciousness in the book beyond the overview effect, and I think it's very real that these things will happen. If you want to talk about the future of humanity, the future of humanity is totally tied to space exploration and development. And that is the human future. So everybody should be interested in it.
All right. Well, I think that phone is telling us to. I'll let you answer that phone. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you, and bye-bye.
Bye.